Hello viewers, welcome back for my review of the Violet Evergarden movies. If you've already seen them yourself, it will probably be no surprise that I have significantly more to say about one than the other, but I do want to talk about them both. I mentioned that some sections of the series could feel episodic, but now having seen everything the franchise has to offer, I do want to say that it all comes together really well to form one complete tale. So while the main plot of the first movie isn't super important to the overall story, it does give some interesting insight into the progress being made in the world in the 4 years between the show's end and when the movies take place. The first movie is called Eternity and the Auto-Memory Doll. Violet's been hired to go to a fancy girls' boarding school to tutor a student there named Isabella York for the next 3 months. Something that's a little outside her usual job description, but the girl's from a very important family, and Violet was recommended by the royal family of Drossel, whose daughter she helped in one of the anime episodes. So the company agrees, to keep up good public relations if nothing else. Isabella's a little standoffish when they first meet. She doesn't really fit in here at the school, and hasn't made any friends, but as she and Violet start to grow closer, you learn that her life has been a lot more complicated than her classmates. Once upon a time, Isabella York was Amy Bartlett, an orphan growing up in a little village that was hit hard by the war. There was a single, kind of throwaway line explaining why the York family tracked her down and took her in. It sounded like she is the illegitimate child of someone in the York family, and apparently they were desperately in need of an heir, because she agrees to go with them and change her name, in exchange for the Yorks making sure the little girl she'd adopted as a sister is taken care of. Though, I do have to say, for how wealthy and connected the York family is made out to be, I feel like dropping her in an orphanage was less than the bare minimum of what I would have expected from that deal. But I guess at least neither of them had to worry about starving to death anymore. The first half of this movie is Violet's time with Amy, which ends, of course, with Violet writing a letter for Amy's sister to remember her by, even if they can't be together anymore. The second half takes place a few years later and follows the little sister in her quest to become a mail carrier and bring joy to others the way Amy's letter brought joy to her. It's a cute story, even if the sister is actually a little annoying. But to be honest, it's not the movie plotlines I really want to talk about, so much as a big element that may not have even been intentional. This'll come up again later. It's the main reason I wanted to talk about the first movie at all. For a series that's all about discovering what it truly means to love someone, Violet Evergarden is very light on the romance. Most of its storylines focus on platonic, familial kinds of love. The one big exception is this first movie. On its surface, the main relationship it focuses on is the one between the sisters, but the way it portrays Violet and Amy's friendship, they always phrase it as a platonic thing. They really talk up how neither of them have much experience with having friends their own age, and there are some things I'm willing to overlook. Bathing together and sharing a bed can be platonic things, not so often at their age in a Western-themed society like this one, but whatever. It was some of the other, subtler cues that made me convinced that someone behind the scenes was teasing their relationship as a romantic thing. Presenting it in a certain light. The way Amy's classmates kept swooning over Violet, referring to her as Amy's knight. The way their time together ends with a ball, which they attend together, wearing outfits that wouldn't have been out of place at a wedding. I'm not trying to suggest that all this has any deeper meaning. There was never any chance of them actually ending up together. A sudden romantic tinge to the story just really stood out to me, because the lack of it was something I'd noticed throughout the series. Which, in kind of a roundabout way, brings us to the second movie, titled simply Violet Evergarden, the Movie, and if you're worried about spoilers for the canon plot, this is where you'll find them. The movie opens several decades into the future, following the legacy of one of the more touching episodes of the anime. Violet had been hired by a dying woman with a young daughter, Together, they wrote a series of letters to be delivered to the daughter each year on her birthday for the next 50 years. In the present day, that daughter's recently passed away, and her granddaughter, a young woman named Daisy, discovers her box of letters. Struggling with her grief for her grandmother and a rocky relationship with her parents, Daisy takes a trip to Leiden, where the old postal company has been turned into a museum, to learn everything she can about Violet Evergarden. The movie switches back and forth from past to present. When we return to Violet's days as an auto-memory doll, the world's progress over the past 4 years is brought back into the limelight. There's already talk of the auto-memory doll job becoming obsolete, as telephones are becoming more and more common in everyday households. Violet herself doesn't seem terribly worried about this like some of her co-workers are. She's grown very content with the life she's built for herself since the war, but that all comes screeching to a halt when Hodgins discovers a letter in the company's warehouse with information suggesting that Gilbert may still be alive after all. I think I made it pretty clear in my review for the anime how I felt about a storyline that would bring Gilbert back to life, but that's where I found myself, so I did my best to give it a chance. Gilbert's story is that he was somehow saved from the wreckage of the final battle and taken to a hospital and a church to recover. I find it a little hard to believe that there was no way to identify him just because he'd lost his dog tags, but okay. He was lost after the war, haunted by the things he'd done, especially the way he'd used Violet, sending her into battle again and again. He recovered physically, albeit now being down in arm and an eye, and retreated to an isolated little island in Garteric territory. This island was hit particularly hard by the war. Not a single soldier who went off to fight came home, so Gilbert, going by a different name, decided to stay here, help out with the farming and hard labor, teach the children. It would be an admirable penance, if it felt a little more justified. But there are 3 big elements to this movie I want to talk about, so we'll get to all of them in a minute. When Violet hears that Gilbert's still out there, she of course drops everything to see him again. While she is happy in her new life, his death did remain the one thing she could never quite come to terms with. She would visit his mother's grave every month in his place. Initially, Gilbert pushes her away out of guilt, but Violet writes him a letter, basically attributing all her success now to the kindness he once showed her, and proving to him that she's not irreparably broken by her experiences in the war. So they have a big, dramatic reunion, and ultimately Violet decides to stay with him on this little island, and they spend the rest of their lives here. I have to say, I was satisfied with the way the movie handled one of its biggest hurdles. Violet spent the whole series finding her independence and praising her new job for how fulfilling and important it was. No matter how much she loved and missed Gilbert, it's just hard to accept the idea that she'd drop everything she's worked for all this time to be with him. Kind of backtracks on the proof of her own growth. It was saved by 2 things, though. They'd all been talking this whole time about how the auto-memory doll job wouldn't be relevant for much longer, and Daisy ends her journey on this little island, which she learns set a record for the most letters sent per person in a single year, so that softened it out a bit. As for the rest of it, I'd be curious to hear how everyone else interpreted Gilbert and Violet's relationship. I think they left it vague enough that it could go either way, but personally, I'm relieved to be able to still view it platonically. My greatest fear as the movie progressed was that it was going to end with Daisy meeting their grandchildren or something. This experience took me back a bit. Last year I reviewed an anime called Kanon, and I described the relationship between its 2 main characters as everything but the kiss. Basically, what I meant is that, although there was nothing inherently romantic about their gestures or the way they interacted with each other, the way the writers set up their relationship had a distinctly romantic feel to it. Violet and Gilbert are like that, but opposite. Violet is 18 at the time of the movie. She was 14 during the anime. Although they do establish that this is a world where girls do get married as young as 14, and sometimes to much older men, There was always a lot of focus on how Gilbert saw Violet as a child. It's a big part of why he felt so guilty. That alone would have been enough to make me feel a little weird if they had ended this one with a wedding or something. But it runs deeper than that, too. Like I mentioned when talking about the first movie, for a series that was all about love, it just didn't have a lot of focus on romance. Particularly near the end, and especially during this movie, they mostly examine the love between siblings, and throughout the anime, nearly every storyline is about the love between parents and their children. That's the kind of vibe I get from Violet and Gilbert, what it feels like they were setting up. He played such a big role in shaping who she grew up to be, and she was just so helpless, emotionally, when he knew her. Now that she's matured a bit, I'm not saying a storyline where they fell in love romantically couldn't work if it was developed properly, but that's just not the story we got here. I'm at peace with both of those aspects of this movie. The issue of Gilbert himself is a little more complicated, and I knew from the start this would be the hardest point to win me over on. That Gilbert survived at all is still a bit of a plot hole to me. I don't feel like the explanation they gave was enough. But also, Gilbert surviving introduces other complications. Gilbert's character in the anime was fairly uncomplicated. He was just a good guy who died a tragic death. Perfectly easy to like. Now that he's still alive, they had to make him human and flawed, and I think some characters are just better off simple. At least at this point in the story, there wasn't time to explore those flaws or allow him to learn and grow from them. This faking his own death penance is hard for me to accept, because at the end of the day, Violet wasn't the only person in his life who loved him. He let his own mother go to her grave thinking he'd died some horrible death in the war. You know when a character is so self-sacrificing that it loops back around to being selfish? When their atonement reaches a point that they're the only one it's really making feel better, because they've at least convinced themselves they're doing the right thing. That's how Gilbert started to feel for me, but he remained in a role where he needed to be perfectly likable. This was kind of a low point to end on, so I'd like to remind you that it did score well on 2 out of the 3 things I was worried about. I do think this was a good movie, and a good ending. I just wouldn't say it was a better ending than what the anime already gave us. That moment in the last episode of the anime where Dietfried tries to give her his final orders, to live her life in a way that honors Gilbert, and she thanks him but announces that she doesn't need orders to move forward anymore. Nothing in this movie topped that scene for me. I think the anime's ending is already really great, and is arguably a happier ending in some ways. At the very least, it cuts the timeline off before anyone had to really think about this job that they all love losing its meaning in the future. But I'm definitely not suggesting that anyone who loved the series shouldn't bother with the movie. I don't think it ruined the overall experience, and I know the question of which is the better ending is a very subjective thing. So I'd say definitely give it a chance if you never saw it. And if you somehow found yourself at the end of this review without having any experience with Violet Evergarden, that first movie, Eternity and the Auto-Memory Doll, could be a good introduction, a way to test whether the series would be for you. Romance vibes aside, it is very true to the tone of the series and its characters, gives you a feel for this world and the kind of issues it addresses. I'm glad I've finally gotten to experience it for myself. Thank you for watching.